this fantasy, punching holes in the walls of reality. All my life I wanted to fly, but I don't have the wings, and I wonder why. Break away.
Awesome. Overlays aren't working. Perfect start to episode 1.41. I don't know what it is. Every once in a while, Firebot just says no thank you, so maybe want to lay off those channel point rewards tonight. But, you know what? Let's do this real quick. Let's close down the bot, restart it. Yeah, I'm sure. And then you all get to say hello one more time tonight. But welcome in to episode 1.41 of Fixer's Heavy Metal History. Tonight, counting tonight, we've got 5 to go. Yeah, the inconsistency is weird, Gilly. It's bothersome to me as well. So I tested Streamloots before we started. This has been so consistently working. I was like, sure, we're not going to have a problem with that. One thing I am going to check real quick is to make sure that the overlay itself didn't get turned off in the scene in which it exists. Dr. Death, welcome in again. As well as Terry, thank you for the 22-month resub. Rocket, J. Mitch, and Gilly, thank you for the hosts. Yep, I'm not seeing where this would be turned off. So it's just, that one worked. Other ones didn't. I don't know. But we'll roll with it for this evening. There's Gilly.
Yes, I'm excited.
Lips are burning.
And that one worked.
New. As my
All right,
mouth
we'll roll with it.
becomes
So, if you couldn't tell from the intro this evening, we have a pretty jam-packed episode. There are a lot of names that don't have a whole, well, half those names have everything to do with each other. But, here's your board for this evening of the people we will be talking about. This is the most people I have ever put up here to talk about in a single episode. It's very busy, and I have a map to show you still. So, the map will come near the end of the episode. But it's a lot of people to talk about this evening. I am admittedly putting more into these last 6 episodes than I have been putting into the prior 40 in order to kind of compress us down so that 1.45 is still our ending point. So thank you all for being here, for participating, for wanting to learn. And we're going to get going here this tonight. So last episode, we ended things. Manny, welcome in again, my friend. Last episode, we ended things with a circuit where we went around and observed all of France's new allies, all of those little sister republics and annexed territories who were all super thrilled to be joining in the French revolutionary project of liberating mankind, which their part was getting wrung dry financially, having their economies collapsed and seeing their known way of life torn asunder. In this episode, we're going to take a look at France's posture toward its remaining enemies, which of course includes the British as the only declared belligerent left, but also the Americans, who Tallyrand is about to accidentally provoke into an undeclared war in the Caribbean. Once we are done listening to the stream of bold-faced lies coming out of Tallyrand denying he had anything to do with it, we will return to the French domestic front for the elections of year 6, which will, as we have been foreshadowing, suppress the left this time. Then we will also get General Napoleon Bonaparte launched on his ultimately ill-fated Egyptian expedition. All of this taken together will then set the stage for the Second anti-French coalition by the end of 1798, and the resumption of full-blown war in 1799 in the form of the War of the Second Coalition. Now, France is not at peace with everybody, but this is a lull for them. You know, Britain, they're only fighting at sea. The Americans are only going to fight them at sea. I mean a full-blown war back on continental Europe. So the peace, yeah, as Gilly just said in chat, wasn't very long. And if you recall, when we went to war during the Legislative Assembly days, I did say this was a generation of conflict. So this is kind of peace for France, and it won't last for very long. So to back us up a little bit, the Treaty of Campo Formio, which was that treaty that actually ended hostilities between Austria and France, had been signed by Bonaparte and the Austrian ambassador Count Philipp von Cobenzl, who is in the corner upper right, in October 1797. And that had settled things between France and Austria. You remember that was that treaty where France got basically everything that they wanted west of the Rhine and said, here's Venice, have a nice day, and it was kind of controversial. But the Austrian Habsburgs were just one component of that insanely complicated political coalition, which you will recall is called the Holy Roman Empire. They were the most powerful part, to be sure, but they were still just a part. So shortly after Campo Formio, a huge summit of all those small components of the Holy Roman Empire met at the city of Rastatt along the Rhine to discuss and ratify those terms, which the French and the Austrians had kind of worked out on behalf of everyone else. And as you can probably predict, especially for those little German principalities that were technically part of the Holy Roman Empire, the most controversial part of the terms of the Treaty of Campo Formio was, of course, ceding the little German principalities all along the west side of the Rhine to France, because they didn't get any say in it, and all of a sudden they're being told, you're French now, you're no longer a part of the Holy Roman Empire, you belong to them, not us anymore, and they weren't consulted. So in these negotiations, the French delegation, which was led by a man named Jean-Baptiste Treillard, which is the black and white pencil sketch, one to the left of Count Philipp von Cobenzl, Treillard was not making it easy for the German princes to accept these losses and these terms. Now, Bonaparte had agreed in principle at Campo Formio that the new territorial acquisitions made by the French at the expense of the Holy Roman Empire would be matched by compensatory lands, Venice, somewhere else, which is why the handover of Venice occurred. However, at Rastatt, the Austrian delegation now asserted that ceding the left bank of the Rhine constituted a new territorial acquisition for France, that effectively Venice equaled Belgium, but this stuff you want here along the Rhine, that's something new, and we're going to need something else in return. All of us, of course, here at the table, not just us, the Austrians, but all the German princes need compensated as well. And Treillard said, fat chance. The left bank of the Rhine has been under French control for a really long time now, so it hardly counts as a new acquisition, sir. And this was just the first of many, the biggest one, but the first of many squabbles that led the Congress of Rastatt, the Second Congress of Rastatt, nowhere fast. And in the end, it is known as the Second Congress of Rastatt because the First Congress of Rastatt, there was another one historically that happened in this city, actually ended the War of Spanish Succession in the early 18th century. This Second Congress of Rastatt would never come to any formal agreement of peace before the War of the Second Coalition got going in 1799. Excuse me. So you have all these people, not just Austria and France now, up in Rastatt trying to actually solidify the peace, and it never happens because everyone starts quibbling over every little bit of territory right along the Rhine. But as an aside, this guy, Jean-Baptiste Treillard, is pretty important, and he's pretty interesting. We've just never had him bubble up to prominence until now, but he was elected a deputy of the Third Estate from Paris to the original Estates General in 1789. And then he was elected, obviously, into the National Assembly because everyone just transferred over. And his most important early role was he served on the Ecclesiastical Committee of the National Assembly, where he was one of the lead guys promoting the original civil constitution of the clergy. And then, like all other members of the National Assembly, he was ineligible to serve in the Legislative Assembly. Thank you, Robespierre. So he became president of the Criminal Tribunal of Paris. But during his time there, he was judged as lacking a specific type of firmness, or read that to be ruthlessness. He was then elected to the National Convention. Trayard was president of the National Convention from... Thank you, Eddie. He was president of the National Convention from the 27th of December, 1792, until the 10th of January, 1794, and in this capacity served as first magistrate during a part of the trial of Louis XVI, in which he voted for death, which makes Trayard yet another regicide. He was an inaugural member of the Committee of Public Safety, like when it was first formed. He served on that committee from 7 April 1793 until 12 June 1793, so right up until that reconsolidation in the summer of 1793 of the committee's power took place. He was actually one of the guys that was kicked off. He was excluded during that shuffle, but he survived the Reign of Terror. And after the Thermidorian reaction, he returned to the Committee of Public Safety because it was still kind of functioning. It had all of its power stripped. And he served on it again from the 5th of November, 1794, until somewhere in August 1795, when it really was just being dismantled at that point. He then served as chairman of the Council of 500 in the month of Nivose, year 4, which is 22 December 1795 until 23 January 1796. And in his speech to the Council of 500 on the 21st of January 1796, he excoriated monarchy. He just denounced it. That happened to also be the 3rd anniversary of the execution of Louis XVI. In 1795, he arranged the exchange of the daughter of Louis XVI, Marie Theresa of France, who would be the future Duchess of, bear with me here, Angoulême. That's Louis XVI's daughter, who had been held a prisoner of the Republic since pretty much the entire royal family had been taken captive. She was exchanged for commissioners of the French army that had been betrayed by General Dumouriez. Remember when he crossed over the lines in the spring of 1793? So the daughter of Louis XVI was exchanged for basically prisoners. General Dumouriez's betrayed aides were handed back to France in exchange for Marie Theresa. And most interesting, Trayard will become one of the 5 directors on the 15th of May, 1798, or 26 Floreal, year 6, in replacement of Francois de Neufchâteau, who I told you last week was going to get his name pulled from the hat, legitimately I'm sure, after less than 1 year of service. For the Directory, though, the situation in Italy and along the Rhine was certainly settled enough that they were able to tell Napoleon Bonaparte time to come back to Paris to help them deliver the death blow to the one active enemy left on the field, the British. And as we have also discussed, that death blow was going to be nothing less than a full-blown invasion of Great Britain. Now, this talk of a multiple front invasion of the British Isles had not been killed by the failure of the Irish invasion under Lazar Hoche in 1796, and indeed, when the Directory really started to discuss plans regarding the invasion of Britain, Hoche was again the most likely candidate to lead the invasion. Now, remember who Lazar Hoche is, because you'll understand why I'm recapping this in a moment. Lazar Hoche was that guy during the Women's March on Versailles, who led his National Guard company into the royal chambers and protected the king. and he had marched his way through prominence, was the final arbiter of the war in the Vendée, had been appointed Minister of War for a moment, but generally had had a really good career up until things kind of went sideways in Ireland, and then he went, back out to the Rhine frontier where the fighting was largely over. He's had a pretty interesting run. And he was, due to that run, still the candidate the Directory wanted to go back and have another crack at the British Isles. Almost all of those troops that were massing along the French Channel coast with Great Britain had served under Hoche at some time or another, and he actually himself, Hoche, was eager to redeem himself for that failed invasion of Ireland, which, not surprisingly nor unjustly, he blamed on the weather. But sadly, in September 1797, Lazare Hoche just up and died, probably of tuberculosis. He was in his base along the Rhine River, just, waiting to make sure the war was over. He was only 29 years old. And after his death, it left the Directory with no other alternative, really, than their best general, Napoleon Bonaparte, and turning to him to lead the invasion of Great Britain. So here we go. The Directory says, okay, Italy looks good, you signed a treaty, come on home. But this return of the very triumphant and, at least on paper from Napoleon, undefeated, he did lose once, but undefeated Napoleon, it was really nerve-wracking for the directors, right? On one hand, here he was, the conquering hero, the man whose victories had helped legitimize the rule of the Directory, and the man whose pledge of support before and after the coup of Fructidor were key to that coup's success. Remember, Napoleon's out there telling his own troops, I'll go back to Paris with you and burn it all down if they decide to usurp the government. But on the other hand, here he is, a conquering hero who is way more popular inside the army and among the French citizenry than the men of the Directory could ever hope to be. But Bonaparte was, if anything, a careful planner, and he had no desire to seize power, yet, at least not on this trip. So while Napoleon was in the capital, he was conspicuously deferential to civilian authority, something he had not been during his time in Italy, right? Because he's out there creating countries without any mandate or directive to do so. But when he comes back to Paris, he demurs. He just puts his head down and pays the due respect to those in positions above him. He made no outward displays of his military might or the army force that backed him, which was probably at this point the best army in the French military. He dressed as a regular civilian during his time in Paris, instead of marching around in a full dress uniform, which I'm sure he wanted to do. So when the Directory ordered him to go take over this planned invasion of Britain in the wake of Hoche's death, he said, sure thing, without any objection or argument. He said, I'll go do it. But while he was in Paris, he also spent a lot of his time making political contacts, such as meeting Charles de Tallyrand for the first time. He also sat down and met the Abbé Emmanuel de Sieyès for the first time, the man who had scorned his own appointment to the first slate of 5 directors because Sieyès had his own constitutional plans for France. So the guys in blue on the board, the future Brumaire Coup guys, they finally come together because the Directory told Napoleon to come back to Paris. They finally get to sit down and meet and talk about who knows what in person for the first time. These meetings, obviously, would be the seeds of the coup of Brumaire. Bonaparte, Talleyrand, Sieyès were almost assuredly in this visit to Paris firmly starting their plot against the French Directory over the winter of 1797 and into 1798. We're going to talk about that 4 episodes from now, when it all comes down for the Directory, and Talleyrand and Sieyès basically point to Napoleon and say, that's your man. But while these meetings were taking place and the seeds of the next and final coup for the Directory were being sown, what was not being sown was actually an invasion of Great Britain. Bonaparte does not seem to have arrived in the army camps along the French Channel coast with the intention of aborting the invasion. It seems like he went there with at least an objective perspective to see what is the state of things before we do anything. But it didn't take him long after he got there to decide that the whole thing really needed to be called off. This was no small thing that the Directory was asking him to do, and with the Dutch Navy, you'll remember, just having been ravaged at Camperdown, the invasion fleet assembled was simply insufficient for the job in Napoleon's opinion. This was then to say nothing of the men themselves, who were not the crack troops forged in the battles of Italy, but rather Hoche's men from the Vendée and the Pyrenees, who had, I know our timeline's been moving pretty quickly here, but these guys hadn't seen major action and no major battle for a couple of years now. So after his inspection of the French coast camps, Bonaparte came back to Paris, informed the directors that he would carry out the invasion, but stipulated the absolute earliest he believed he would be ready to go was the end of 1798. He then went a little bit further and told the Directory that he doubted that the invasion would be successful even if he was given that time to prepare. And this is actually one of Napoleon Bonaparte's biggest concerns at this point, right? Yes, he lost a battle, but it didn't get reported publicly that way. At this moment, he is invincible. He's had a setback or two in Italy, but largely he was unbeatable. He had won the war in Austria without losing a single battle, according to his official dispatches. So why risk this well-won reputation on a dubious mission to England that might wreck his career when it probably ends in colossal failure? Lucky for the directors, Napoleon Bonaparte had an alternative suggestion for them. In that period between the preliminaries at Leoben, when they were kind of setting down the framework for peace with the Austrians, and the Treaty of Campo Formio, where they actually got peace with the Austrians, Bonaparte had been sitting idle, just kind of hanging around, doing the daily work of a general who wasn't fighting, and started to think more globally. Specifically, that the best way to take out the British was not to try to occupy London, but rather to try and occupy Egypt, and limit British access to their wealthy colonial holdings in India. So after Napoleon returned from his dismal survey of the army along the Channel coast, he told Tallyrand that what France should really do is invade Egypt. Not only would the conquest be easier, but it would promise a lot of plunder, which probably perked up Tallyrand's ears immediately, and it would also provide a sharp check on British power. And he's not wrong. Strategically, it's not a bad idea, especially because the British don't have easy naval access to Egypt. Talleyrand, of course, thought this was all a great idea, since he also carried major reservations about the plan to invade Great Britain. But again, let's be honest. Napoleon probably had Talleyrand at the concept of a lot of plunder. So Bonaparte and Talleyrand took the plan to the French Directory in March 1798, and the Directory said, okay, go do it. Do you know what Britain's trade with India was? Off the top of my head, at the end of the 18th century, do I know the specific commodities that were being traded? No. I don't have that off the top of my head. I just know that, largely speaking, the transit of Western goods to the East and the Eastern goods to the West is largely profitable at any point in history, just because of the difference between the two, and that goods made in the East could be made more cheaply than they could be made in the West as well, if they could be manufactured there. But you have to understand that, and we're going to show this on a map far further down in the episode, there was no canal connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Sigh, 22 months at Tier 2, thank you very much, my friend. There was no Suez Canal yet. So what happened is, it was still quicker to sail goods into the Mediterranean It was still quicker to sell goods into the Mediterranean and then move them overland across the small Sinai land bridge and then put them in the Red Sea and sail them out into the Indian Ocean than it was to go all the way around the Horn of Africa. Now, it was not faster for warships. Warships still did that. They still went all the way south. But for commodity ships that had all this stuff on board, it was literally faster to unload and reload onto a different ship. So taking out Egypt would limit Britain's ability to do that, to take those commodities across the Sinai land bridge and force them to take the same very risky route around Cape Horn. Yeah, and by occupying Egypt, you could control the Sinai land bridge. Correct. So it wasn't a bad idea at all, because it would force all British mercantile traffic to the east into a very, very narrow corridor along the south tip of Africa that, if planned well, could actually be exploited by the French Navy, who could deploy to that area faster than the British could, because they were just a little bit further south. They had Mediterranean southern coast ports that could shoot out through the Straits of Gibraltar and just get there faster. But Bonaparte and Talleyrand take this plan. They say, hey, let's not go to Great Britain. That's attacking the heart of the British Empire, both through their greatest strength at sea and then onto land where the bulk of their military forces are. Let's go and take out Egypt. And the Directory said, okay, go do it. And for the Directory here, the math was really simple as well. Not the whole idea. That's awesome. Google's just talking to me right now. The plan for the Directory, the math for the Directory here was awesome, or it was simple. And they weren't talking about the whole idea of, well, let's disrupt British trade. They were more concerned about Napoleon specifically. What do we do with him? So if Bonaparte pulls it all off, well, everything he just said would come to fruition. All this stuff about cutting out a critical logistic lane for the British, cutting their trade, that all sounds great. But if Napoleon Bonaparte would fail, well, then maybe that's just one less super popular general we have to worry about coming home and overthrowing the directorial regime. So as the Second Congress of Rastatt went nowhere, and Napoleon really did at this point start to have the conversations with Sieyès and Talleyrand about maybe we should replace the Directory was more than willing to send him away just because it made complete political sense to them, more than it made military sense, but that wasn't the heavy weight on the scales for the Directory. So while Talleyrand was helping Bonaparte arrange the Egyptian campaign, he was also in the process of introducing a new belligerent into the war with France. A belligerent who had gone to some pretty extreme lengths to stay out of the fighting in Europe, but at this point in history could simply resist no more. The United States of America. We have not talked about the United States hardly at all during 40 episodes of the French Revolution.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
But tonight, we are moving that 15-star flag over to the At War with France column, not because there was a declared war. There isn't an actual declared war by the U.S. Congress. They tried to. And what ends up happening is a more focused war down in the Caribbean around French colonial holdings and trade routes. It certainly was war. It was fighting. It was interesting. So for at least a little while, we're going to throw that American flag over on the left-hand side. Relations between the United States and all sides of the war. All sides of the war of the First Coalition had not been awesome during the presidency of George Washington. First president of the United States, hopefully you all know that one. Washington insisted on American neutrality, but by doing so, he irritated everyone, which caused both the British and the French navies to harass. Oh, you need to stop for customs inspection. Oh, we need to take an extra special look at it. We need to make your life difficult. Harass neutral American shipping. to prevent the Americans from assisting either side. So when a ship was bound for France, the British would intercept it and go, what you boys got on here? And just make their life difficult, and vice versa. France would intercept American ships going to Great Britain and say, what you guys got going on here? And just make it annoying. Thank you very much, Loud Car. Just make it annoying for the Americans to do mercantile trade with either side. They were neutral, and George Washington was fervently a neutral, just neutrality. The United States was so young as a nation, he did not want America to get embroiled in Europe's wars so shortly after becoming a country. He recognized that the United States needed time to build up a navy and build up an army, but also didn't need to waste so much of its no resources doing that in the early stages. But in 1796, Washington finally accepted the efficacy of the somewhat humiliating Jay Treaty, in which he agreed to nearly every concession, condition, and constraint that the British were demanding of the Americans in exchange for their British Navy just leaving the Americans alone. And American history will portray Americans as the good guys at all time, but they really weren't. No one's a good guy. Not all the time. But this treaty, which is also known as the Treaty of Amity, Commerce, and Navigation between His Britannic Majesty and the United States of America, was negotiated by John Jay, which is why it's known as the Jay Treaty. And it did gain many of the primary American goals as well. This included withdrawal of British army units from forts in the Northwest Territory that it had refused to relinquish under the Treaty of Paris, which ended the American War for Independence. But the British had also been retaliating against the United States for reneging on Articles 4 and 6 of that same 1783 Treaty of Paris, which ended that war. The fourth article of the Treaty of Paris, Mads, good evening.
I don't know which of us he's in.
The fourth article of the Treaty of Paris, which again ended the American Revolutionary War, the War for American Independence, stated, quote, recognizing the lawful contracted debts to be paid to creditors of either side, end quote. What's that mean? Well, that means that the treaty made it so that both Britain and America had to recognize contracted debts, especially America. America, who didn't have a government before the treaty was signed, recognized internationally, but would have one after. That the debts that they had accrued in order to win the war had to be honored. They couldn't repudiate their debt like, France had just done. So Article 4 basically said, pay what you owe people. And then Article 6 stated, quote, the United States will prevent future confiscations of the property of the Loyalists, end quote. Now, the Loyalists were those American colonists who didn't want independence, who wanted to stay loyal to the British Crown, and who, quite frankly, had been harshly repressed by the ever-increasing strength of the revolutionary government. So the treaty said, basically, don't take out any acts of reciprocity on the Loyalists. They're now Americans. They had the option to come home, but they didn't. The Loyalists who remained in America were specifically protected under Article 6 of the Treaty of Paris. American state courts impeded the collection of debts owed. Wow, I just lost my place in my notes. Oh, here we go. American state courts impeded the collections of debts owed to British creditors. Violation of Article 4. American state courts, not the federal courts, but American state courts were preventing the states from paying back Britain and others the debts they owed. Clear violation of Article 4 of the Treaty of Paris. And those same American state courts upheld the continued confiscation of Loyalist estates. That sound familiar? America was doing something similar before the French ever did it. They had confiscated Loyalist estates and were using them as fiscal collateral, in spite of this explicit understanding that the prosecutions and executions of this seizure of property should be ceased immediately at the Treaty of Paris. So you have the Americans who are basically going and giving Great Britain the finger over two of these core articles of the Treaty of Paris, and that's why Britain was not so happy and so willing to harass American shipping, on top of the fact that they didn't want anything from America making it to France if they could help it. In the Jay Treaty, the parties agreed that disputes over wartime debts and the American-Canadian boundary were to be sent to arbitration, by the way, meaning they sat down with a mediator to figure out where the American-Canadian boundary was going to be and where some of these disputes over debts were going to be settled. And this is one of the first major uses of arbitration in modern diplomatic history, believe it or not. I'm just mentioning this as an aside at this point because it's interesting. This set a precedent that would then be used by other nations in negotiating peace treaties, especially ones that involved borders. The Americans during the Treaty of Paris were also granted limited rights to trade with British colonies in the Caribbean in exchange for some limits on the American export of cotton, because cotton was already king and Eli Whitney was about to make it king of everything in the South. So obviously when the Jay Treaty was signed in the mid-1790s, the French were pretty pissed off about it. They perceived this agreement with the British as an absolute betrayal by the Americans. The Americans, who they had helped found their nation. That's true. But also remember that the French took their sweet time getting there, and the first French squadron of ships that were supposed to go help the Americans showed up for about a couple of months on the north coast of New England, and then went down to the Caribbean for a while, then decided to come back, and literally a couple of weeks was the window they had to bottle up Cornwallis. So, yeah, they did a lot, but it probably was a much bigger thing in the French people and French government's mind than it really was. The Americans would not have won the war without the French, period. But it's not like the French were sending battalion after battalion after battalion of French troops onto the coast on the Atlantic to really fight alongside the Americans. They were sitting there blockading the British, which we needed to have happen. But they were also sitting there looking at their watch saying, you guys need to wrap this up in a couple weeks because we're going to pull out of here. No. France's contribution was financial. It was materiel in terms of the means to make war, such as cannon, muskets, shot, powder, uniforms, food, etc. But the major thing, the major tactical thing that the French did to help the Americans win the War of American Independence was blockade Cornwallis at Yorktown. They had advisors and they had placed troops on the American shore before, but it wasn't for very long. And like I'm saying, I'm not trying to diminish the French contribution to winning the War of American Independence because I'm an American. But I also believe that in the French mind, it was more than it was. Which is why when America signs the Jay Treaty with the British in 1796, 1797, when Congress ratifies, it was perceived as one of those you've besmirched my honor slaps by the Americans to the face of France, which is what the important point is here. So, despite these rising tensions out on the high seas with France and Britain both harassing American shipping, Washington retired from everything. And that's that moment in history where you're like, holy crap, George III couldn't believe he did it. He could have been emperor. But after 2 terms as president, he just stepped down. In the vein of Cincinnatus of old Roman times, when the dictator would simply just lay down their power when the job was done, George Washington stepped down as president after 2 terms, setting a precedent that would last until, the 1930s. But the point is, when Washington retired in March 1797, the United States of America was still neutral. They were not at war with anybody. Then incoming President John Adams proceeded to go to some pretty crazy lengths to try to maintain this neutrality, keeping America out of Europe's wars. But Washington stepping down, yes, it was a magnanimous action, but it created the hyper-partisan divide we still experience to this day. It created a polarized partisan battle, which erupted between pro-British Federalists, who were led by Alexander Hamilton, and pro-French Jeffersonians, which were led by Thomas Jefferson. As soon as Washington was done, and there were people who didn't really like Washington to begin with, but he was George Washington. There was nothing you were going to do about the fact that he had the support of the people, and that was more than he was ever going to need. But as soon as he was gone and John Adams became president, this divide that had been lingering underneath it all probably ever since the Treaty of Paris was signed and the debate over the Constitution started, just manifested. But despite this partisan bickering between the Federalists, which is where the Federalist Papers get their name, and the Jeffersonians, despite this bickering, which truly defined the early days of American politics, no one did more to screw up American neutrality in France than French Foreign Minister Talleyrand. Believe it or not, you're never going to hear it mentioned in a American history class unless you're in college. But yeah, Talleyrand's the guy who messed up American neutrality more than anybody else in the Jefferson or Hamilton camp. Don't forget, Talleyrand had, of course, just spent 2 years living in the United States. So he knew, or thought he knew, the political lay of the land. And he knew that Adams wasn't too particularly well disposed to the French. And this was confirmed in Talleyrand's eyes when Adams dispatched Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. So he's the guy in the bottom row in a military uniform. He dispatched Charles Cotesworth Pinckney to be the new ambassador to France. Talleyrand knew Adams, and he knew Pinckney, and he knew that Pinckney was a staunch Federalist, which made him very and avowedly anti-French. So Adams picks an ambassador to France, and basically is a poke in the eye to France, right after France just got upset at the Americans for signing the Jay Treaty. So, at Talleyrand's recommendation, the Directory refused Pinckney's credentials, which is basically, you just don't refuse another nation's choice of ambassador unless you've got like a criminal case file on them. You just say, yes, we recognize you're the new ambassador, rubber stamp, go enjoy your time in whatever the ambassador's residence is. But Talleyrand convinced the French to refuse Pinckney. Like, don't recognize that this guy is the ambassador. Adams, not wanting to capitulate to this slap in the face from the French, but also not wanting to start a war over it, he then dispatched U.S. Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, who would be later Chief Justice John Marshall, along with New England merchant and well-credentialed patriot leader Elbridge Gerry, to join Pinckney and to form a three-man diplomatic commission to work through this impasse, which basically Talleyrand was creating. When this three-man commission then presented itself to Talleyrand to be recognized in October 1797, he refused to recognize their credentials unless they agreed to A, loan the French a bunch of money, and B, wait for it, pay Talleyrand a huge bribe, equivalent to 15,000 British pounds. It's 1797. 15,000 British pounds. That's a lot of money. Now, bribes for consideration were routine. They were very routine as a part of European diplomacy. But Talleyrand took it to a high art, as he claimed there was simply nothing that could be done unless the U.S. Diplomatic Commission paid him a great deal of money. So, obviously, the Americans were pretty offended by this. This old world corruption that these new men of the American continent were having their nose in the air to, because how dare they? This is not the land of kings. You know, they were the new beacon of democracy, and for some of their minds they were. How dare these men subject us to these ways of Europe? That was really the mentality. Pinckney himself famously said, no, not a sixpence to Talleyrand. So, because they refused to buy him off, Talleyrand rejected all three of their credentials, and negotiations then had to start going through unofficial channels. Those unofficial channels turned out to be a trio of Talleyrand's agents, who would come around and say to the three men of America, just pay the money and you're in. What's so difficult about this? These agents were later identified in redacted communiques as agents X, Y, and Z. Their names were never revealed. But That's why this whole thing historically is known as the XYZ affair. So the incensed Americans then retreated and refused all informal talks, demanded to either be credentialed or America would sever all diplomatic ties with France. This is 1797. It's less than 20 years, really, since... It's about 20 years since the Constitution was all done and dusted. Not more than 25 years since France was sitting there helping America found its nation. And here's the Americans being refused basically because Tallyrand wanted to be paid off. And now they're saying, we will sever all diplomatic ties with you if you don't accept our ambassadors. But Tallyrand managed to convince Elbridge Gerry, who was the least anti-French of all three of the commissioners sent by Adams, to maintain a super secret back channel to stave off war, if for nothing else. But Tallyrand also made it very clear that he could no longer do any business with Pinckney, which Pinckney said he had zero problem with because he hated Tallyrand. And then in April 1798, both Pinckney and Marshall just got on a boat and sailed home. In the meantime, the dispatches that these three men had been sending back to Washington, D.C., had been creating a full-blown scandal. Now, this is not George Washington's Congress. This is John Adams' Congress, a very partisan Congress. And they are having notes sent home from three very well-respected men saying the French are not only being absurd, but they are insulting us. We're going to talk about what the American Congress did in reaction to the groundwork that Tallyrand had helped lay when we come back from a break. Hopefully you're all enjoying yourself. This is a hugely interesting episode because we're going to take a huge just left turn later on as we get away from the now brewing American war with France in the late 18th century. Stand up, get a drink, catch your breath, consolidate your notes, walk around, do all that stuff, but definitely stand up. I will talk to you in a few minutes. Thank you all for being here. Again, Cy, Turi, thanks for the resubs, and I will be right back. yep, that overlay's just not going to work for some reason tonight. We'll make a new one and whatever, rebuild it. Weird, but anything that's going to do video here is just not going to work. So, we're back. And before we went to the break, we talked about how Charles Pinckney and Marshall, the two of the three men President John Adams had sent to France to try to sort things out with the French, had gotten a boat and came home. And Tallyrand was effectively using three go-betweens to tell the American delegation, pay me some money, 15,000 British pounds, and we'll talk. But simply nothing can be done unless you pay me. Yeah. So the dispatches from these three men had been going back to Washington, D.C., and Congress had been reading that, and they'd been creating a full-blown scandal. Members of Congress, members of the American Congress, knew that the talks with the French were going nowhere, and that this was very likely due to French, meaning Talleyrand's, deceitfulness and greed. The Federalist congressmen, those pro-British, anti-French congressmen who kind of followed the beat of Alexander Hamilton, they started calling for an outright declaration of war against France. The Jeffersonian, the pro-French congressmen, of course, wanted to avoid this at all costs, which led them to make a massive tactical error. You see, some of the stuff had been making it to Congress, but President Adams, taking those extraordinary steps to try to avoid war, had actually been keeping most of the details of these dispatches coming back from France pretty secret. The Jeffersonians believed that Adams was doing this because Adams was a Federalist. They believed Adams was doing this because he wanted war and was trying to make the French look as bad as possible before going there. But the Jeffersonians had it completely backwards, obviously. Adams knew full well that if the American Congress knew the truth about Talleyrand's insulting refusal to credential the ambassadors and his demands for a just purely naked bribe, that war with France would simply be unavoidable. So, after relentless Jeffersonian pressure to unseal the dispatches entirely, Adams finally relented in March 1798, which is right around the time that Napoleon and Tallyrand are going to the Directory saying, let's go invade Egypt. Instead of exposing President John Adams as an anti-French warmonger, it turned out the French had been behaving worse than even the wildest rumors had it. And President Adams had actually been acting pretty responsibly, trying to keep it under wraps to keep his young nation from going to war. But with the XYZ affair now out in the open, Congress as a whole pushed for an aggressive stance toward France. So they ordered the Navy, the American Navy, to expand. And in July 1798, they voted to annul the Treaty of Alliance that had been in place with France since before the end of the American Revolutionary War. Since 1778, Congress annuls that treaty with France and says, we're no longer allies in any way, shape, or form. You won't accept our ambassadors. Why should we consider you our allies? Justifiably so. The American Congress then authorized the American Navy to attack French vessels. But President Adams, who was still fighting and gripping neutrality with all he had, no matter how technical this distinction might be, when Congress authorizes the American Navy to attack the French, it's a declaration of war. And Adams refused to sign it. When Congress puts the declaration of war on John Adams' desk, he said, no, thank you, I won't sign that. Which puts things in a weird light, because most of the time in American history, when the Congress has decided to go to war, they've been in lockstep agreement with the president. Or is the president saying, I need you to send me one? There are not very many times in the history of democracies where a fairly unified legislative body says, yep, we need to go to war, and the chief executive and commander-in-chief of the military says, Just one of those moments in history that sticks out, and you're like, what? But he did. John Adams refused to sign the declaration of war, and Do you override that? It didn't veto it. So where's the American Constitution stand on a president that says, no, thank you, I'm not signing your declaration of war? So what happened was, like I said last week, what is known as the quasi-war. The American Navy still sailed out to do exactly what Congress just told them to do. They just did so without the signature of the president on the declaration of war. It was a 2-year-long conflict. Again, known as the quasi-war, which the Americans judiciously decided to fight at sea only and almost entirely in the Caribbean. That was pretty smart by them, because if they had decided to start sailing on the open Atlantic, and then maybe they started thinking about coordinating with the British, it probably would have dominoed them into Napoleon's wars. And they luckily avoid it because they don't go there. Again, in the grand scheme, the quasi-war between France and the United States is a low-level fight in a secondary theater of the larger war. And the British and American navies never coordinated, and they never acted jointly against the French. And that probably saved America. Still, provoking the Americans to attack French ships on the high seas didn't help French interests at all. And of course, when Tallyrand was brought into the Directory to say, hey, why are the Americans kind of declaring war on us? Tallyrand, of course, lied his head off. He said, I had nothing to do with this. I don't know who X, Y, and Z are. Who are they? He even went so far, Tallyrand did. Tallyrand goes so far as to start up a fake investigation. I'll get right to the bottom of this and figure out who these guys are. That's Tallyrand marching right out the door. I'll figure out who X, Y, and Z are. Yeah, he's incredible. Which is why there is a 1983 biography simply called Tallyrand on him that I want to read. So this XYZ affair is not Tallyrand's finest hour, right? He doesn't get his bribe. He pulls another belligerent into a secondary war theater with France, probably when they didn't want it, at sea, when they were already being stretched there against the British. Yeah, I investigated myself and found nothing wrong. But Tallyrand will survive this, like he survives almost everything. So while the Americans were getting ready to jump into the quasi-war in the spring of 1798, the Directory still wasn't mostly concerned with foreign affairs, but with domestic affairs. Specifically, as we roll into the spring of 1798, the Directory was focused on the looming possibility that Jacobin leftists were about to get themselves voted into a majority of the legislative councils and drag France back to the dark days of year 2 and the terror. And that's the real terror, not the directorial terror or whatever. So, yeah, okay, the Americans are at war with us. We got bigger problems here. The 3 directors are going to go, well, we can't lose our seats. We can't give up our power. So we need to focus on what's about to go down in these elections. We spent the last 8 months pounding the right, and we completely haven't learned a lesson that's been taught to us 4 times during this French Revolution, that we need to, if we're going to be oppressive, we've got to oppress everyone equally all the time, not play whack-a-mole. But they played whack-a-mole. And they whacked down the right, which allowed leftists to become resurgent. And now they're staring at these elections going, uh-oh, we should probably do something about that. So while the triumvirate running the Directory had hoped that last year's coup of Fructidor would be that one-off emergency coup, that they decided they couldn't risk it. And the anti-right coup of 18 Fructidor gets its historical twin in the anti-left-wing coup of 22 Floreal. So the left wing we're talking about here was not the leftist radicals of the old days. The true firebrands that we have known in the past when we hear the word left and radical, like Georges Danton and even Robespierre before he decided he was a centrist somehow. The few true remaining radicals post-Thermidor had been taken down with Gracchus Babeuf and that conspiracy of equals. I did fail to follow up on him, by the way. I said Babeuf would stick around for a while and then never really got back to him. But after that failed Grenelle uprising, when the leftists went in and tried to agitate the Paris Grenelle regiment, the garrison, to stand up and overthrow the government or something. There's really not that much to tell since then for Babeuf. He sat around in prison until May 1797, so about a year ago in our narrative. And he was, he and one of his close associates were then finally sentenced to death by, wait for it, guillotine on May 27, 1797. Remember how we kind of transitioned to firing squad? They put Babeuf down underneath the guillotine. So the guillotine's not gone, like I said. It was quick and simple, and that was the end for everyone's favorite proto-communist. But these former Jacobins, who were now putting themselves forward for election, were of a perfectly kind of moderate variety. They weren't the Great Terror Jacobins. They were dangerous to the Directory, not because they wanted to overthrow the government, but because if they got into the legislative chambers, they might turn out to be self-confident enough to form some manner of actual opposition party. These leftists that are the target of the Floreal coup supported a platform that was about expanding enfranchisement, making the Constitution more democratic, and maybe doing something about the land speculators who had flourished in the days since Thermidor. Those are all pretty reasonable things. So it's the reason I'm harping this point is because you hear Jacobin, you think Robespierre. That's not who these guys in this moment are. They are much more moderate in terms of what they're looking to do. So these were fairly conventional reforms, and had the triumvirate been a bit more self-confident themselves, the elections of year 6 could have marked the beginning of a contentious but ultimately stable republic with two parties competing for power and the loser settling into being the opposition upon defeat. And in this system, you have the chance to become the majority every year. So this was a overreaction by the triumvirate in the Directory to say, we need to put this down. Because had this not happened, and democracy been allowed to go, and a stable, functioning, two-party opposition system established itself, maybe Napoleon doesn't have the leg he needs to stand on in 1799 to bring it all crashing down. This was really the moment where the Directory shot themselves in the foot for the last time. So obviously the triumvirate didn't want that. They didn't want a self-confident opposition. They wanted legislative councils who would be compliant and docile and just send us the bills we want because we can't generate it, and budget us the way we want because we can't do that either. They wanted a mere rubber stamp for their wishes because they weren't really leading a democracy anymore. They had kind of established themselves as a less murderous, less insane Committee of Public Safety within the Directory. These guys just wanted to hang on for as long as they could. Term limits be damned in some of their thinking sometimes. So the burgeoning opposition party of these moderate Jacobin leftists had to be killed in the eyes of the triumvirate before it could get any bigger. So, of course, the regime was entirely responsible for this growing confidence of the left, right? Because they had targeted royalists and conservatives in the lead up to and the aftermath of the coup of Fructidor. The Directory had found it useful to encourage, had found it productive to go out and say, oh, if you're a committed Republican, well, yeah, come on out. As long as you're attacking conservative and royalists in our game of whack-a-mole, you're free to do whatever you want. Their newspapers were never touched after freedom of the press was revoked. And semi-official clubs of the directorial regime called constitutional circles invited all good Republicans into a coalition against the monarchists. It wasn't that they were just ignoring the left. They were encouraging the left while they were trying to smash down the right. But now, those royalists and conservatives have been smacked down pretty hard. And as the elections of year 6 approach, the Directory thought it had a pretty good handle on the right wing. And then they pivoted and said, uh-oh, all those guys we've been empowering and encouraging to smack down those guys, we have to come over here and smack down these guys now. And it's like they couldn't think past one move. We'll just whack, 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 and then they could only focus on one enemy. It's interesting. The entire 1790s are like this for France, where they just can't focus on more than one bad guy. The elections that were coming up in the spring of 1798 were critically important. This is the election that would clear out the last of the old Thermidorians who had been protected into their seats by the law of 2/3. This is the last vestiges of those guys. This is now we're actually running things the way we're supposed to in the legislative councils per the Constitution, kind of, if there hadn't been a coup. But it was also slated to fill the vacancies that had been created by the coup of Fructidor when they voided all those seats, because those seats had just been empty since then. In the elections of year 6, 437 seats were up for grabs. So unlike the elections of year 5, when the Directory waited for the voting to run its course and then react to those results, in the elections of year 6, they made plans in advance, very carefully, to control the process from beginning to end to get who they wanted. On January 1798, the directorial government passed what is known as the credentialing law, which stated that the outgoing legislative councils would have the right to confirm the newly elected delegates. Before you take my job, I have to confirm that you can take my job. This law further implied that the outgoing legislative councils would be the ones verifying the election results and passing final judgment on any electoral disputes that may arise. And then this is the key. The Directory sent out agents to make sure there were as many electoral irregularities as possible for the legislative councils to certify or not before they gave up their jobs. So in February, the regime passed a further law stating that the incoming new director would be elected by the outgoing councils and not by the newly elected councils. So this whole thing was rigged from the start. The primary electoral assemblies started meeting at the end of March 1798. And right away, those agents and supporters of the regime worked very hard to muddy the waters in those electoral assemblies. The basic tactic was to intentionally create schisms within the various electoral assemblies. So take, for example, a Parisian electoral assembly which has 609 total electors. This is actually one of the ones it went down in. Agents of the directorial regime would determine that about 2/3 of those guys were ready to vote for the opposition, ready to vote for leftists or maybe even royalists. So they would go out into these assemblies, these agents of the regime, and they would gin up some sort of technical violation and then say, take the 210 electors who they knew who were on their side, they'd lead them out of that electoral assembly and establish a new body of electors down the street. This is the new legitimate body of electors. Sound a lot like what people in the United States wanted to do in the aftermath of our last presidential elections? Because it sure is. And then the agents of the regime would reconvene those 210 legitimate electors down the street as the true legitimate electoral assembly. And those 210 of 609 would elect a delegate from a list of pro-regime candidates, mostly drawn from the slate of existing government appointees who owed their position and livelihood to the regime already. So here you go. You've got two rival slates of candidates from all the assemblies, which were split in such a way that, of course, means that these disputes had to be submitted under the new law to the sitting legislative councils for review, and then have them decide which one of these two pools of electors were legitimate Again, this is exactly the kind of crap that people who support Donald Trump wanted to do to the American governmental system after our last presidential election. I'm not partisan, but it was a usurpation of democracy, and you can see the same thing happening here historically, where someone didn't like how the election looked for them and decided to rig the electors of that election in their favor, except the Directory was successful. So this sort of maneuvering went on all over the place. And the most useful technical violation was to trot out that law, which had been imposed by Lazare Carnot, which said candidates and electors had to swear a hatred of monarchy and the Constitution of 1793. So whenever an anti-regime leftist won in a pool of electors, the candidate, let me rephrase this. So whenever anti-regime leftists won, the regime candidate or one of these agents that was present would assert that they were for anarchy and for monarchy and for the Constitution of 1793, and they had just perjured themselves. The anti-regime candidate would, of course, deny it, but lo and behold, here you go. You now have a dispute that needs to be resolved by the legislative councils. It's quick and easy to do. That person is definitely a monarchist. They just perjured themselves. There's a law that says they have to take an oath, and they are a monarchist. They're lying. What do? Well, now we take it away from the electors, and we just hand it off to a rigged body of existing legislators who already support the regime to pick the correct candidate, of course. So with the returns starting to come back, and those returns not looking good for the Directory, the legislative councils then announced on May 2nd that they had uncovered a conspiracy between royalists and left-wing anarchists of all groups to combine together to undermine the Republic. It's been a good long time since someone has uncovered a conspiracy for us in the French Revolution, but here we are. The legislative councils announced on May 2nd that they have found one where the extreme left and the extreme right are working together against the middle somehow. I think if you look at our own situation in today's world, we know that's probably impossible. Funny that Thury should say Robespierre is back from the grave, because this is just as Robespierre had once denounced a bear as an agent of the foreign plot, trying to discredit the revolution. So the accusation now was that under the red cap of liberty that all of these leftists were wearing, they wore the white cockade of royalists. That's insane. But with this looming threat, the legislative councils decided that it would only be prudent to process all of those contrived electoral disputes together. With so many contested results out there, going through them one by one would just drag on well into the summer. So on May 7th, the Directory submitted a list of summary judgments. The Directory did, not the legislative councils. The Directory said, yep, here's this list of all these disputed elections. I'm going to go ahead and write down who I think should be the winner here and hand that to you, legislative councils. That's what they did. The Directory submitted a list of summary judgments on which delegates would be allowed to take their seats and which would not. And then they asked the legislative assemblies, or the legislative councils, to simply approve the entire list in one vote, which they did on May 11th, 1798, or 22 Floreal, year 6, which is why we call it the Floreal Coup. So, back it up. All these elections happening in these assemblies where just someone walks in, creates a little controversy, and just boop, sends it off to the legislative councils for review under all these new laws. Now you've got a stack of them. And the director says, let me have a look at that massive stack. I'll help you guys out here. We'll just jot down some notes here. And hey, have that back. Just vote on that. Yes or no, up or down. Is that good? Oh yeah, it's good. Great. We're good to go, guys. That's the coup of Floreal. And when you don't pay attention and you let people monkey around with elections like this, it'll happen like that. History will show it to you repetitively that if you let people mess around with elections like this, it is super simple for one domino to just fall into three others and it's over. Why is this not leading to riots by the sans-culottes? They're not starving. And also remember that their power has been completely debased. There's no National Guard comprised of sans-culottes anymore. There's no easy access to weapons anymore. They've all been confiscated. Their leadership has been decimated. There's nobody out there on the street willing to rally them anymore. So that's why it's not leading to riots by the sans-culottes. We're winning the war. The Vendée is no longer oppressed. All those little things that added up to sans-culotte anger over the years are gone for the most part. Oh no, I agree with you, Gilly. It's what kind of worries me too. The stuff that happened this last go-around in the United States isn't being prosecuted. There's no extra protections being put in place, and it very much feels like it was a dry run. But I didn't want to get into this too hard. I knew this was just right for it because of the way this coup of Floreal goes down. But it is absolutely, welcome in, Fish, and enjoy your lurk, is absolutely the same basic premise. Let's mess with the basic electors so that they produce the candidates we want, or at least the disputes we want, so that we can very easily and very quickly legislate in who we believe our guys are and completely usurp the way an election works. France pulls it off. The Directory pulls it off very quickly. In like the 2 weeks in May, it's just done. Now, conditions in modern times are different, where the information to the everyday person is different, but we still, as everyday citizens, are not hand-on lever able to control what these people who are our elected representatives, what they're doing. We just can't, pull the ejection seat and say, you're gone, you're crazy, get out of there. We may not be able to act fast enough. Most people will just go, because they're disinterested. But again, the parallel is just striking between that event in 1798 and what happened here basically on January 6th. But this coup that happened in Floreal, to get back on topic, was not quite as sweeping as the coup of Fructidor. Though the Directory altered results in 49 of the 96 departments, only 9 departments had their results completely outright annulled. Of the 437 open seats I mentioned, only 127 candidates were declared invalid. And that's still a lot. I say only, but it wasn't all of them. So only 127 of 437 were invalidated and replaced with Directory-approved delegates. That said, denying over a quarter of the men elected by a majority vote the seat that they had actually won isn't going to earn the Directory any awards for integrity. And that is also the risk here and everywhere else where democracy is being attacked, because if you allow naked rigging like this to occur, then everything else that nation's democracy is dependent upon, trust for finances and loans, all that goes out the window. And it's not just as simple as a man wishes to remain in power. It is, once that man is in power, the systems upon which he depended for power are nowhere near as stable as they used to be. Because everyone will look there and go, huh? Well, how do we send money there if they need it? How can we trust that guy? How can we trust that system? It's a lesson that no one wants to learn. It's a lesson that the directors are going to pay for, though. As it would turn out, many of the delegates who were allowed to take their seats were allowed to do so because they were not implacable opponents of the Directory. Well, let me rephrase this. As it turns out, the delegates who were allowed to take their seats, so the guys who were like rubber stamp approved, allowed to take their seats, they weren't opponents of the Directory, but they would become disillusioned. They would become disillusioned by what went down during the coup of Floreal, so that when the bigger deal coup of Brumaire comes along, these guys are going to go like, well, why would we want to save this system? Yeah, sure, it got us into our jobs, but it's obviously corrupt, and maybe we should just let it fall. So when Bonaparte, Tallyrand, Sayes, and others decide to walk in the door to topple things, they're just going to kind of go, yep, I'll just get out of your way. The guys who the Directory just helped get into a seat. Among those allowed to take their seats during the coup of Floreal were two of Napoleon Bonaparte's brothers. This is also important for the coup of Brumaire. One was the former ambassador to Rome, Joseph, who is like kind of gold framed right next to Napoleon there to his right. And then the much more energetic and brash younger brother, Lucien. Joseph is actually Napoleon's older brother, but Lucien is Napoleon's younger brother. Lucien will play an even bigger role in the coup of Brumaire. Imagine the excitable young kid in a house of three. That's Lucien. The guy who always feels he needs to prove himself because he's the youngest kid. That's Lucien Bonaparte. Remember to clonk that follow button. In one of their last acts, the sitting council, the outgoing council of 500, and the Council of Ancients replaced that recently appointed Francois de Neufchâteau in the Directory. In case you were wondering why the oh-so recently appointed Francois de Neufchâteau was even eligible for the retirement lottery, considering Barral, Ravelier, and Rubel are still there, it's because he had taken over one of the original seats, Carnot's seat. So he technically was serving on Carnot's tenure and not new tenure. So, even though he himself was new, the seat he occupied was one of those original 5 that had to be voted out until they were all gone. It was super convenient that his name was pulled out of the hat instead of, say, one of the triumvirate's names, huh? Just funny how they just keep sticking around. And as I said, Francois de Neufchâteau was replaced by Jean-Baptiste Tallyrand, who was that French lead negotiator at Rastatt. What Tallyrand's election meant was that the Directory was now controlled by men who would push aggressively for the projection of French power abroad, instead of making any compromises with the rest of Europe that, tend to reduce the chances of war. So the Directory is no longer like kind of split. Barral, Ravelier, and Rubel are in control. These other guys, Dadouis and Tallyrand, are certainly of the same line of thinking, but now they all form a cabal of men who pretty much see it the same way. We must project our power. We must not compromise, and it will lead to war. It will lead to a bigger war. It will lead to the war of the Second Coalition. So, while all of this was going on in Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte was down in Toulon, and as Gilly had mentioned, he is the guy who liberated that city in 1793, preparing to embark on the Egyptian expedition that would really super reduce those chances of avoiding a future war. We're going to talk about the wild trip of Napoleon to Egypt and the man who would chase him there, and then later on, next episode, the man who will destroy his navy there. We're going to get to that when we come back from our second break. Thanks for hanging out with me tonight. The Coup of Floreal is one of those just how moments for me, but it went down a year after the right went down in the Coup of Fructidor, because there are no more insurrections. The insurrections are coming from inside the government now. So I wasn't fibbing back when I said no more insurrections, because insurrections come from the outside. But the constant meddling with the government is going to continue until 1799. And then again in 1804. But we'll get there, and I digress. When we get back, the magic boat ride of Napoleon to Egypt and everything that goes on in it. And I will get to introduce one of my other probably top 10 favorite historical figures ever. So get up, walk around, take a break, go to the bathroom, get a drink. Make sure you stretch your legs at least. And I'll be right back. Thanks for hanging out, everybody. We're back. Welcome back. I am back. I hope you're back. When we left for our break, the coup of Floreal had gone down, and while that was all going down, Napoleon Bonaparte was not in Paris. He was down in Toulon. He was getting ready to head for Egypt. And as I said, that trip to Egypt was going to further exacerbate or reduce the chances of keeping the peace, because you have a warmongering directory now. You have a directory who's like, nope, we have to be hard line. We cannot give an inch. We must punish the enemies of France. And now you have Napoleon, who's getting ready to sail to Egypt to punish one of those enemies of France. But while he's down there, he's going to make a bunch of other people angry too. But as I mentioned, the directors were super happy to see Napoleon off. Like, bye-bye. Have fun storming the Sphinx. Bye-bye. Because they wanted him gone. The leftist candidates that the directors had just purged from the legislative councils were not feared half as much as the invincible little corporal Napoleon Bonaparte, who would now be thousands of miles away from home, either winning the Republic a great victory or disappearing into the sands of Egypt, either one of which they were cool with. So as Napoleon got ready to go, his destination was a very closely held secret. The directors, Tallyrand, a few of Bonaparte's top generals, obviously a few of the top naval commanders, and some of his closest aides knew. But other than that, everyone getting onto these ships didn't know where they were going. Now, that was done on purpose, because loose lips sink ships, and they didn't want anybody to basically understand what they were up to before they were long gone. So though British intelligence was alerted to the fact that the French were massing forces in the Mediterranean ports, they didn't know where those forces were going. By May 1798, 40,000 soldiers, 10,000 sailors, and hundreds of ships of all sizes, now that's tender ships all the way up to ships of the line of man of war, were prepared to set sail to wherever Napoleon told them to go. Most of them didn't know where he wanted to go yet. But of course, and this is one of the great things that happened as a part of this campaign, Napoleon did not just gather soldiers for this expedition. He famously assembled a company of scientists, engineers, intellectuals, scholars, and artists to travel along with the army to make a great investigation of Egypt. This company, numbering 167 men, were brought along for 4 big reasons. First, Bonaparte was a child of the Enlightenment and an advocate of its progressive scientific principles, so including these academics would simply advance the sum total of human knowledge. Having them come down along for the ride and investigating what was in Egypt would make the world smarter, and Napoleon was all for that. Second, on a more immediate and practical level, these guys would be available to improve supply lines, because some of them were engineers and scientists and intellectuals and scholars. They would be able to improve the supply lines for the French army, map out roads, identify sources of food and supplies, and then make sure it could all get from where it was to where Napoleon's army was. Third, they would also hopefully get started on one of Western Europe's great engineering goals, that aforementioned linking of the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. Napoleon went down there with the dream of building the Suez Canal effectively. It would dramatically shorten world travel time from Europe to India and China. If that canal was built and controlled by the French, it would give them an immediate and immense strategic advantage over their rivals, especially Great Britain. And finally, and fourth reason, is Bonaparte was a master propagandist. He was really good at the propaganda game. Bringing along all these scientists, he was able to paint the expedition as one of discovery. Oh, we're not going to Egypt as the aggressors. We're going to learn things. That's why I need 40,000 soldiers and less than 200 scientists. He was able to paint the expedition as one of discovery, of himself as the enlightened leader interested in the advancement of mankind, rather than simply another man making a grab at Egypt to cripple the British and establish his own personal power base. And even as things start to go badly for the French army in Egypt, and it will go badly, the scientific hangers-on that remained down there still worked diligently and wound up producing a wealth of new observation and discoveries. The most famous discovery that's going to come along from Napoleon's Egypt expedition of the Enlightenment was the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone is that master key stone that allowed the world to decipher hieroglyphics. Next episode, though, we're going to talk about why the Rosetta Stone is currently sitting in the British Museum and not the Louvre. Because it's not in France, it's in Britain. And we'll talk about why next week. Next episode, hopefully. But when Napoleon... I had recently heard a thing about the Rosetta discovery thing. Wild. Yeah, it's an interesting story, Terry. But when Napoleon led the fleet out of Toulon on May 19th, 1798, the ultimate destination to everyone on board, except for that really small group of people, was still unknown. Bonaparte had given a rousing speech to his men when they departed that only hinted at a foreign land rather than saying they were all headed off for Egypt. He was still, at this point, just trying to keep the British in the dark. He didn't want them knowing where he was going. And in this, he was actually very successful. The British were actually quite aware of the troop mobilization, but did not appear at all to have considered that he's probably heading for Egypt. There's a very famous anecdote from the British Secretary of War in these times where he says, quote, well, maybe they're making, or not quote, sorry, I'm paraphrasing, maybe they're making a run to Egypt. And the British Foreign Secretary says, try to think with a map in your hand. It was that, the idea of the French invading Egypt was viewed that cynically as a possibility by the French ministerial power in London. Like, there's no possibility. There's no way they're going there. The British just did not think that the French were about to send their best general and 40,000 men to the other side of the Mediterranean, even when they shortly pondered the possibility. Except that's exactly what the French were about to do. So the biggest reason that British intelligence was so imperfect and Napoleon could even dream of this kind of campaign in the first place was because after Bonaparte started boot stomping the Austrians in Italy in 1796, maintaining a fleet in the Mediterranean was really, really dangerous for the British. Like, they just could not keep ships there safely. Because Toulon obviously had been emancipated back to French control, liberated, I guess is the term, back to French control in 1793, and shipbuilding efforts were right back where they were. And now the French had allies in Italy and all along the Western Mediterranean. So the British only point of entry into the Mediterranean Sea was the Straits of Gibraltar. And sending ships in there was super dangerous for the British. So they really had just kind of pulled out of the Med. They just weren't there anymore. And they pulled them back to the mouth of the Tagus River. And at this point, I'm going to bring in the map. I want you to get a good look at this guy, though, Horatio Nelson, because he's the British commander and that top 10 guy in history that I love, that we're about to start talking about as well. And while we're zoomed in, have a look at the likeness between Joseph Bonaparte, Lucien Bonaparte, and Napoleon Bonaparte. It's striking. Like, you know these guys are related. I know they're paintings, not photos, but still. But we're going to bring in the map now so you can follow along with what's about to go down. And I had to kind of draw this one by hand. Just so you know, you can see on the left-hand side of the map that there is the Tagus River. There's Lisbon. That's where the British fleet has had to pull itself back to. Let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger for you guys. There we go. So the British had pulled their fleet out of the Mediterranean entirely and stationed them at the mouth of the Tagus River, which empties from Spain into Portugal and into the Atlantic Ocean. From there, the British were running a blockade against the Spanish port of Cadiz, which, because of the Spanish treaty with France, Spain was actually kind of switching sides to support France, and the British didn't like that very much. So they were using it to blockade Cadiz, which is down here, right where the tip of this red arrow is, sticking up there. If I could just click in there and show you actually what I'm looking at. Right in there. That's Cadiz. So they were coming out of this basic area and using it to blockade Cadiz. Then, the British also used this position to go after any merchant vessels trying to pass through the Straits of Gibraltar that they thought might be trying to aid the French in any way. But with the French so now very obviously up to something, the British Admiralty decided it was time to take the risk of sending some ships back through the Straits of Gibraltar to try to do something about what the French were up to. Now, the first order of business for the British would be figuring out where the French fleet was right now, where it was, and where it was going. And for this, the British Admiralty appointed Rear Admiral Lord Horatio Nelson to be in charge of this new Mediterranean fleet. And by this point, Lord Nelson was already well on his way to becoming one of Britain's great naval legends. But his greatest triumph is going to come down the road during the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 during the Napoleonic Wars, running very much the same type of blockade against this Spanish port of Cadiz that is currently going on right now. So when we come back to the Battle of Trafalgar in like 2,800 episodes, remember this conversation about what the Tagus River Cadiz blockade was in 1798, because it's going to look very similar. Still, the success that Lord Nelson will enjoy during our next episode will form a major part of the legend of Admiral Nelson after the very famous Battle of the Nile. But in terms of our narrative, Nelson had just returned to the Mediterranean fleet from London, where he was recuperating because he had just had one of his arms amputated due to wounds suffered during the Battle of Santa Cruz de Tenerife in July 1797. So like less than a year earlier, the guy had an arm cut off. During that fight, Nelson had his right arm amputated after his upper arm was shattered by a musket shot during a failed landing attempt, like a shore landing attempt. He returned to his ship after being injured, which was called the Theseus, to have his arm attended to. He refused assistance while reboarding his ship with a shattered right arm. And within a half hour of getting back on board the Theseus, his surgeon had already lopped it off. Within another half hour, so 1 hour total after coming back aboard, having his arm taken off by a surgeon, Nelson was back on the deck of the Theseus, because he's an admiral, issuing orders to all of his captains. Nelson was not naturally left-handed. He had his right arm amputated, and that was the arm he wrote with. He would develop phantom limb syndrome as we know it today on his right side. And yet, a guy who is now learning how to do everything with his non-dominant hand, his greatest triumphs are still ahead of him. And it's a shame I'm not going to be able to go into more of Nelson's life here, because he's a truly fascinating character. And one of those rare, generally decent guys of history. He's a remarkable man and sailor. And maybe when I roll into season 2, I'll do more of an august profile of him, as I've done in the past for some other people, as he becomes even more prominent. But he's a legendary figure, a legendary admiral. Even today in the British Navy, he's a legendary guy, and he's a legendary historical figure. But yeah, the Battle of the Nile is the next big thing for Lord Nelson. But we got to get there first. For our purposes now, Nelson was given command of a 6-ship squadron and told to go find out where the French were and where they were headed. And on May 9th, 1798, Nelson took his command back through the Straits of Gibraltar and into the Mediterranean. And hopefully I've done a decent job illustrating the paths here. Red is obviously Nelson, blue is obviously Napoleon. Nelson's squadron, well, let's do this way. What happens after that, right? They get into the Mediterranean. What happens next is kind of like a comedy of errors on both sides. Not intentional, not egregious. It's just kind of funny how it all shakes out. This chase to Alexandria, as I like to call it, even though no one calls it that historically. It's not really much of a chase. Just more like a bumble to Alexandria. But Nelson's squadron arrived at Toulon. He actually sailed directly to Toulon, where they knew Napoleon was. And on May 21st, so basically 2 weeks after he entered the Mediterranean via the Straits of Gibraltar, he found out when he got there that the French fleet had just departed. But just then, a pretty nasty storm rolled in and scattered Nelson's 6-ship squadron. Nelson's flagship, so you'll see that line now coming south from Toulon, that first straight line. Nelson's flagship and another ship of the line wound up anchored off the southwest coast of Sardinia. Meanwhile, Bonaparte's fleet was hugging the coast, passing Genoa, to pick up more men, more ships, and supplies before crossing down and heading south along the east coast of Corsica, and then passing past Sardinia. On June 3rd, Napoleon was finally alerted to the fact that the British had ships on the other side of Sardinia. And he set a squadron, which I have in that kind of dotted line. He set a detachment squadron of his ships, or at least asked the French admirals to, but for this case, I'm going to just mean that when I say Napoleon sent them. Napoleon sent a squadron to investigate, but the time they got there, Nelson had already sailed back to Toulon. He had tried to go back to Toulon, so that's that curved line going back north, because he's trying to regroup with his other 4 ships. And Nelson really didn't know until much later how very close he came to intercepting Napoleon right then and there. So while Nelson sailed northwest toward Toulon, Bonaparte sailed southeast toward Sicily. A few days later, when indicated by the X and merchant intercepted on the map, the British captured a French merchant who stated that he had just seen Nelson. Probably didn't. And relayed that the British admiral had a fleet right on Napoleon's heels, which he didn't. This caused Bonaparte to panic a little bit, and he ordered his fleet to race for the Isle of Malta. Malta is a historically fun island to talk about because it's tiny, but it's been huge in a lot of conflicts all the way through World War II. If you actually look at the modern flag of the Isle of Malta, it has the St. George Cross in it because the entire island of Malta and all of its inhabitants were awarded the St. George Cross during World War II for holding out against the Nazis. It's just an interesting place. But Bonaparte says, head for Malta. Now, Malta, in this period of time, is still run by the Knights of Malta, which are an old Crusades-era brotherhood of knights. It's the late 18th century. And the Crusade-era knight organization, recognized by the Vatican, is still in control of this piece of territory. And after the Grand Master of the Knights of Malta refused French entrance into the main harbor, Bonaparte took a look around, just ordered the guns to be fired, landed his troops, and just seized it. The Knights never really stood a chance, obviously, especially because half of the 2,000 Knights of Malta who were living there were French, and they had no interest in fighting against their own countrymen. Bonaparte promised the equivalent of 3 million livres in exchange for the island, and the Grand Master accepted, of course, because he literally had no other choice. I'm not sure if that was ever paid, by the way. I can't find any confirmation of that whatsoever. Of course, the intelligence from that British merchantman about Nelson had been all wrong. Nelson had now linked back up with his fleet and some reinforcements, but he was nowhere near the French fleet. So basically, by the time that Napoleon's at Malta, Nelson's still pretty much up around Toulon. Even after Nelson got going, welcome in, Dustin. Even after Nelson got going again on June 10th, he was told that the French were at Syracuse, which is actually on Sicily, when really the French were on Malta, further to the south. And this is the huge problem with just
to clonk that follow button.
This is a huge problem with naval warfare before the invention of the radio, effectively. Is that all of these fleets were reliant upon stray captured vessels or hearsay at ports to figure out what the heck was going on. And for this whole opening of the chess match, that is where the chess match that is where are the French and where they are going. Both sides were just working from horrible intelligence. They just didn't have anything reliable to go upon. Naval warfare was still almost completely predicated on knowing a course and trusting that that course was accurate and getting in front of it. And if you didn't have that, then it was a guessing game of what you saw on the horizon and what you could trust from, say, a stray British merchantman who didn't actually know anything. It won't be until June 20th that Nelson finally learned that the French had even been at Malta. And even then, he was told that they had disembarked on June 16th, when really they hadn't left until June 19th, the day before Nelson found out they were there. He was just, at that point, 60 nautical miles from Malta and had no idea and no way of getting an idea that the French had just left. But one thing had become clear to both sides here. The French were headed east. Before leaving Malta, Bonaparte finally decided it was safe to tell his men that the next stop on their journey would be Alexandria, the great city of Egypt, where Alexander the Great is buried, where the historical wonder, the library of Alexandria is. Meanwhile, Nelson huddled with his officers and concluded, based on everything that had gone down so far, that the French were either headed for Constantinople, which is up there where the Black Sea is, basically, just, the narrow area. It's called the Dardanelles today. That's strait. Or they were heading to Egypt, with Egypt being the most likely target, and was a very shrewd guess by Nelson. And Nelson's going to roll his dice on that guess, that educated guess that the French are headed for Alexandria. And it's going to pay off for him. It's going to pay off for him when they roll in there and the Battle of the Nile commences. So, next episode, we're going to follow all these guys to Egypt. And the whole episode is going to be focused on what's going on in Egypt. We're just going to stick with Napoleon. I rearranged everything so we can just spend an episode there. Cover everything that goes down. Bonaparte will successfully land his army outside Alexandria and begin his great campaign. But then Nelson will swoop down and obliterate the French Navy anchored at Aboukir Bay. So whatever Napoleon does after that at the Battle of the Nile, he was going to have a hell of a time getting back to France. But that is the episode. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. It's been here, there, and everywhere. We've covered a great chase across the Mediterranean, a electoral coup in France, a quasi-unsigned declaration of war from the Americans, and just simply why there was never going to be peace at the Congress of Rastatt. And it's a lot of different things to cover. But, as always, it is time for our quiz. Now, for those of you that are lurking about and want to partake in the quiz is simply done by typing !answer, space, and then your answer. It can be as short or as wordy as you want it to be, but it should be a legitimate attempt to try to answer the question. Don't use the term boy or the word boy or the word fix with 2 X's. I highly encourage you to give it a shot. We're running leaderboard for the season, this third of the season anyway, and it helps me gauge how well I'm conveying the information, so give it your best chance here. But here we go. We'll get you over to the quiz board, and thank you as always for hanging out with me tonight, everybody. I've been looking forward to getting to this part of this season where Napoleon's exploits get into full swing. But we're going to get into the first question. Hey, look at that. Didn't clear the answer file. All right, well, here we go. Here's the first question of the night. What was the single biggest point of contention at the Second Congress of Rastatt? Yes, Tallyrand's greed knows no bounds. That is pretty much the reaction as well, doesn't it? Where'd our boats go? 35 seconds. Gilly is in. What was the single greatest point of contention at the Congress of Rastatt. Welcome in, Rocket. I've seen you lurking the whole time, but I didn't want to say hi until you said something. And if you're not following Rocket, give her a follow. Links in the chat right now. You've got 15 seconds left. You are napping. Lurk strats. 5 seconds left. What was the single biggest point of contention at the Second Congress of Rastatt? I mean, quite frankly, it was the notion that those little German principalities on the left bank of the Rhine were newly acquired territory, and those guys didn't want to give that up without some form of compensation. The first answer comes to us from Gilly. Ceding German principalities of France that belonged to the Holy Roman Empire. That's pretty much the answer. The next response comes to us from Rocket, ceding of land on the east of the Rhine and the German princes. Correct. Space. The next question in tonight's quiz is, name one interesting fact about Jean-Baptiste Treillard before he became a director. Rocket is in. Gilly is in with 30 seconds left. Name one interesting fact about Jean-Baptiste Treillard before he became a director. I have heard American professors butcher his name, more English professors actually, butcher his name as Treillard. Or even Trailhard. It's Treillard. 5 seconds left. One interesting fact about Jean-Baptiste Treillard before he became director. Well, he was a third estate delegate. He was president of the criminal tribunal that kind of oversaw the trial of Louis XVI. He was an inaugural member of the Committee of Public Safety, chairman of the Council of 500 for a time, and arranged the exchange of Maria Theresa of France in a prisoner exchange. Treillard. He was on the Committee of Public Safety. Yes, he was on the Committee of Public Safety. Twice, actually. Gilly. Arranged for the release of Louis XVI's daughter. Yep. Anybody else? I don't think so. One more button press. Alrighty, third question. Why was Napoleon Bonaparte tapped to lead the new French invasion of the British Isles? Why was Napoleon Bonaparte tapped to lead the new French invasion of the British Isles? Rocket is in. For napping, Rocket, you got the details down. Gilly is in with 25 seconds left. Why was Napoleon Bonaparte tapped to lead the new French invasion of the British Isles? Gilly, as always, has the paragraph answer. Rocket gives us the answer first. General Hoche had just died at the age of 29. Yep, of tuberculosis. Or if you guys ever read a book and hear that someone died of consumption, that is also what tuberculosis was known as at the time. So he died of consumption, or as we know it, tuberculosis. 29 years old. Was originally going to be the leader of that invasion. Rocket gets it. The next answer comes from Gilly. The Tsar Hoche had died. There were no other generals. No, that's not true. There were other generals available. Also, making Napoleon do it was a win-win scenario for the director. So I'll give it to you, Mr. Exposition, but your second statement's not true. There are plenty of other generals available. Jourdan was available, for example. But yes, sending Napoleon to Great Britain or later Egypt was a win-win scenario for the director. He got him away from Paris, and maybe, hey, if he wins, great for us. And if he loses, Great for us. Gilly gets it. Yeah, half point in the words of Karate Champ. Why? Next question. Why was the French Directory so willing to let their best general in Napoleon Bonaparte leave Europe to invade Egypt? I kind of just answered this. But do more than it's good for us either way. Explain it. Shame on you, Fish! You're trying to steal during a quiz. People are trying to concentrate and don't appreciate having the noise in their ears like that car that was just outside from your stealing. Why was the French Directory so willing to let their best general in Napoleon Bonaparte leave Europe to invade Egypt? Gilly's answer is in. Rocket's answer is in. Thank you again for revving your engine. Buy a muffler. 15 seconds left. It's good to see you, Fish. Time is up. Why was the French Directory so willing to let Napoleon go invade Egypt? Because it got him out of Paris. Because, holy cow! You're gonna drive up and down the street? We're talking. I live on this nice long stretch of road where people just down it all the time. Oh man, fix this, get off my street. Yep. So Napoleon going to Egypt was a win for the Directory because it got him out of Paris. And if he got to Egypt and found success and all the stuff he was promising and cut off British trade, great. And if he died out there, great. It was really good for the Directory no matter what the outcome was, they thought. The first answer comes from Rocket. They wanted him to either lose in the fight and die or lose his popularity with the people for not succeeding. They didn't want him to lose. They would have accepted a win as well. Both of the scenarios you outlined here are both losses. It would have been good for the Directory as well if he had won, because that meant that he would have controlled that Suez land bridge where they could have dug that canal and done everything Napoleon was really promising to try to do. So a win was good and a lose was good, so that's not the full answer. Gilly, if he won, it would be great for France. If he lost, it would kill his reputation and lessen his threat to the Directory. That's pretty much the answer. Here's the next question. Now turning to our American history lesson for the night. What two things were the Americans doing that what two things were the Americans doing that were upsetting the British after the Treaty of Paris? No? What two things were the Americans doing that were upsetting the British after the Treaty of Paris? 35 seconds left. Sai, as always, good to see you. I know I said hi earlier, but thanks for hanging out, my friend. 25 seconds. Gilly and Rocket are both in. What two things were the Americans doing that were upsetting the British after the Treaty of Paris? It did play. It just didn't play the video. All right, the answers. Basically, confiscating loyalist property, not giving it back to them, and just generally continuing to oppress the loyalists that were now American citizens, and they were ignoring the debts that they incurred.
Well, it's about 3:50.
Ignoring the debts that they had incurred during wartime. Gilly, they impeded the collection of debts owed to British creditors and others, and they upheld the confiscation of loyalist estates. Correct. The next answer from Rocket. Not following Article 4 or Article 6 of the treaty to end the Revolutionary War, i.e. paying debt and prosecuting the loyalists. Yep. That treaty to end the War of American Independence against the Treaty of Paris. Rocket gets it. The next question. Now we're into Tallyrand land. Of all the negotiators sent by President John Adams, with a S at the end, of all the negotiators sent by President John Adams to Paris, who was the one most willing, at least, to try to talk to Tallyrand? Gilly is in. 35 seconds. Of all the negotiators sent by President John Adams to Paris, who was the most willing to at least try to talk to Tallyrand? Five seconds. Of all the negotiators sent by President John Adams to Paris, who was the most willing to at least try to talk to Tallyrand? It was Elbridge Gerry, who was a merchant. Gilly gets it right. I bet they did, Gilly, and I bet his answer was he didn't give a crap. I'm sure the Americans tried to take the high ground in their episodes of being insulted, and Tallyrand probably just looked at him and was like, and? I guarantee you that's his deadpan reaction. What's in that for me? I think he also probably operated from the perspective of, you're a tiny new nation. I've been there. Look at what we have. Look at what you have. Look at our Navy. Look at your Navy. Look at our Army. Look at what Army do you have. What are you going to do about it? Yeah, okay. Next question. What shift in electoral policy manifested in the credentialing law of January 1798? What shift in electoral policy manifested in the credentialing law of January 1798? Rockets in with 10 seconds left. What shift in electoral policy manifests in the credentialing law of 1798? You've got 3 seconds. Gilly beats the buzzer. Effectively, it is that the outgoing legislative councils would be certifying the election results. The leaving legislative body could approve, disapprove the results of the incoming body. Yep. I know what you mean. That's correct. What does Gilly say? Sure, it's long. The outgoing councils will now be confirming the incoming candidates. Incoming elected candidates, but yeah. And have to confirm them at the assembly level, but yes. Long story short, they could say, "No, we don't like that one," as long as there was some type of technicality around that which had been submitted to them for review. Gilly gets it. Speaking of those technicalities, what was the primary tactic of the Directory in delegitimizing opposition candidates during the elections of year 6? What was the major tactic of the Directory in delegitimizing opposition candidates during the elections of year 6? You have 30 seconds. Rocket is in with 15 seconds to go. What was the primary tactic of the Directory in delegitimizing opposition candidates during the elections of year 6? I believe Gilly is also in. Yep, that's a paragraph. First answer comes to us from Rocket. To pull the electorates from the main electorates to muddy the waters, electors from the main... To pull the electorates from the main electorates to muddy the waters when they send in false results. I'm not following that. So my answer is gin up a controversy, gin up a technicality, split the electoral pool into two, and claim that of the two, the one they wanted was the legitimate one. You're on the topic, and I think you know what you mean, but I don't know what that means. But I'm still gonna give you the point. Gilly. The law by Lazar Carnot requiring that candidates declare hatred of monarchy in the Constitution 79-3. If they agreed to the oath, they would be accused of perjury, requiring the dispute to be handled. That was the primary type of ginned up controversy. Correct. I work with words, good dudes. Yeah, that was one example of a ginned up controversy that would then in turn be handed off to the Legislative Council for review, Legislative Assemblies for review, and council is the right word. But then the director just said, hey, you know what, there's so many of these, we'll just issue a summary judgment. Can you up and down approve that? Yep, good, we're good to go. Coup done. Gilly gets it. 2 questions left to go tonight. This one is the easiest question of the evening. Turi. Name the major scientific discovery of the educated men Napoleon took with him to Egypt. Gilly is in. Name the major scientific discovery of the educated men Napoleon took with him to Egypt. Turi is in. 30 seconds left. Name the major scientific discovery of the educated men Napoleon took with him to Egypt. Fish. It was not a beer mug. Rocket is in. I've not dropped any frames, Gilly, so that's got to be on your end. I've only missed 4 due to rendering lag, none due to encoding lag. I would say drop your resolution, maybe. Yeah, Twitch has been awful for me for months, too. I get buffering on almost every stream, but it's usually every minute or so. Alright, the answers. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone. Correct. The Rosetta Stone. Turi says, discovery of the Rosetta Stone. Correct. Turi goes to 8. Rocket. Rosetta Stone. Yep. This one's been kicking your butt. All right, well, we go on to the last question here. Hopefully this one's also relatively easy. Describe the major impairment to intelligence while at sea for both Nelson and Bonaparte. It's not 2 beer mugs. No, Sai. We just need to let that one die. Rocket's in, Gilly's in. Describe the major impairment to intelligence while at sea for both Nelson and Bonaparte with 5 seconds left. Final question of the night. I don't have an answer written for this one because I can just describe it. There's no radio. So these guys are completely dependent upon things they can get from others at sea. Hey, what have you seen recently? Without any way of knowing if it's true or not. Or if they pull into a port and basically ask the same questions. Hey, did you see anybody recently? Other than that, they were completely reliant upon their own eyes. What do I see in the spyglass over the horizon? That's it. Which is like why Nelson was 60 nautical miles from Napoleon the day he pulled out of Malta and he had no clue he was there. First response comes from Rocket. Word of mouth is not the best way to receive information as it's super unreliable. Yep. Gilly's answer. The radio hadn't been invented yet. Intelligence could only be gathered from merchant ships and rumors at ports, which are sometimes incorrect. Yep.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
And that is our quiz for the night, I believe. Checking one more time for an answer. That's the last ballot and none after. All right. Thank you all for hanging out tonight. Believe it or not, we've only got 4 episodes. 4 episodes of the French Revolution left to go. Now, here is a little description of what I intend to do. I am going to leave you guys on a cliffhanger at the end of season 1 so that you can wait until August to find out what the next thing is, because that's what successful shows do. You're welcome very much, Gilly. So the Coup of Brumaire is going to be the Coup of Brumaire. But what happens after the Coup of Brumaire, in the days after, as Napoleon begins to take power? What does that all look like? That will be the beginning of season 2. Yes, Gilly will also always give the English major-like answer because he's a Inspector Gilly. But I appreciate you all being here, hanging out, and having an interest. 4 to go until we are episode 1.45 in season 1, a year-plus long journey, about a year and a month long journey, will come to a close. Let me see who's out there. Richie Cranium is out there. We've been rating him a lot, but he's also the guy who's streaming. So we're going to go say hi to Richie yet again. Richie is streaming Minecraft. He has a super fun creeper explosion sound button that you should press as soon as you get there. I could never understand how anyone couldn't see the opening in the wall. Oh, that was pretty funny. Look for that clip in the Treasury. That was awesome. All right, we're going to get out of here. Thank you all for hanging out with me. We will be back hopefully next Saturday night, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. I should have the time to write, but I got a lot of stuff to do with my dad this weekend. Now that he's kind of feeling better, he is also wanting to do things, and now I got to go do those things with him. But I intend to begin writing actually Sunday and Monday during the week, and I am off Tuesday as well. So I will definitely get the writing done, or at least get a really good solid 2/3 foot forward before I even go back to work Wednesday. We're out of here. Have a great rest of your holiday weekend if you have it. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your weekend otherwise. And I really appreciate, as always, all of you showing up, being interested, and wanting to learn about this stuff. Make sure you follow my good friend on Dustin, who popped in here at the midpoint. He streams Monday through Friday, 7:30 to 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Then there's Permanoob, Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. right after Dustin. He is probably done with or near done with Horizon Forbidden West. I don't know what he's going to next. He gets some weird game. I don't know. Then there's Gilly. Gilly, I don't know what the home situation is right now. I know it's kind of uprooted with everything that's been going down, but hopefully we'll see you tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Otherwise, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I don't know. Then there's Rocket, who streams whatever the hell she feels like it. We have no idea the next time she's going to press the go live button, so make sure you pay attention to Big Top Outlaw's Twitter to get that ping when she does. My good friend CF Live wrote music for the show. Awesome dude. Lets me harass him Mondays and Wednesdays on Twitch when he plays the music live for you on his looper. And then Mr. Land Diggity was playing golf with your friends this afternoon. Also wrote some music for the show. We're out of here. Have a great weekend. Thank you all as always, and I will talk to you next week, if not sooner. We're out of here.
Be excellent to each other.